Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of love, resilience, and the fight for justice. Today, we bring you an extraordinary story about Ethan and Emily Carter, a family thrust into a battle against systemic corruption after a tragic act of police violence. This is a story of courage, community, and the relentless pursuit of justice. How far would you go to protect your loved ones and demand change? Stay with us as we unravel this deeply moving and inspiring journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us for today's compelling story. The day started like any other for Emily Carter. 7 months pregnant. She had a noticeable glow. Despite the strain of carrying her unborn child, she had spent the morning shopping for groceries at her local market in Dallas, Texas, humming softly to herself as she navigated the aisles. Her husband, Ethan, had wanted to accompany her, but she insisted he focus on his work. "I can handle it," she had said with a reassuring smile. Emily had always been fiercely independent, a quality that Ethan admired but sometimes worried about. With her reusable bags full of fresh produce and pantry staples, Emily made her way to the parking lot. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and the air was filled with the distant hum of cars and the chatter of people going about their day. She felt content, even happy, as she walked toward her car. The baby kicked gently, as if reminding her of its presence. Emily placed a hand on her belly, murmuring softly, "Almost home, little one." But the tranquility of the moment shattered with the sudden screech of tires. A police car, its blue and white exterior gleaming in the sunlight, sped into the parking lot and came to an abrupt halt just a few feet away from her. The jarring sound made Emily freeze in place, her heart skipping a beat. The driver's door opened, and a middle-aged white man stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his hair neatly cropped, but there was an arrogance in his stride and a coldness in his eyes that immediately set Emily on edge. "Stay right there," the man barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Emily turned to face him, clutching her shopping bags tightly. What did I do wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling but polite. The man, Officer Brian Collins, was infamous in the area. His reputation for abusing his authority and targeting vulnerable individuals was well known, especially among communities of color. Emily had heard his name whispered in warning by neighbors, but she never imagined she would be one of his targets. "You're loitering," Collins snapped, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. The implied threat was clear, and Emily's pulse quickened. "Loitering," she repeated, trying to keep her composure. "I just finished shopping. I'm on my way home." But her calm explanation seemed to anger him further. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "Don't try to act smart," he growled. "This is my jurisdiction, and I don't need trouble from people like you." "People like you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emily felt her throat tighten, but she refused to let fear overwhelm her. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said softly. "I'm just heading to my car." "Shut up," Collins roared, his voice echoing across the parking lot. His anger seemed to bubble over, unchecked and irrational. Passers-by began to slow down, their curious glances turning into concerned stares. Some even pulled out their phones to record the escalating confrontation. Emily noticed them but knew they wouldn't intervene. The fear of retaliation, of becoming Collins's next target, was too strong. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice breaking slightly as she instinctively placed a protective hand over her belly. "Please. I just want to go home." But her words only seemed to provoke him further. Collins's sneer deepened, and he stepped even closer. "Don't think I'll go easy on you because of that," he spat, his tone dripping with disdain. Then, in an unthinkable act of cruelty, he lifted his boot and kicked her hard in the stomach. Emily's cry of pain pierced the air, silencing the parking lot. She crumpled to the ground, her shopping bags spilling around her as apples rolled away and milk splattered onto the pavement. She clutched her belly, her sobs mingling with gasps for air. The baby inside her seemed to react, kicking violently as if in distress. For a moment, the world stood still. The onlookers were frozen in shock, their phones capturing the horrifying scene. Then, chaos erupted. A woman screamed, "She's pregnant. What is he doing?" Others shouted for help, their voices blending into a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. Collins, however, remained unmoved. He glanced around, his expression defiant, as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. He muttered something under his breath and returned to his patrol car, driving away as though nothing had happened. Emily lay on the ground, trembling and in pain. Her hands instinctively cradled her stomach, and she whispered, "Please, be okay." Tears streamed down her face as the gravity of the situation sank in. Her peaceful day, her hopeful anticipation of meeting her child, had been shattered in an instant. The sound of sirens finally filled the air as an ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed to her side, carefully placing her on a stretcher. The baby's heartbeat was faint but steady, and they worked quickly to stabilize her. As Emily was loaded into the ambulance, she caught glimpses of the crowd. Strangers were shouting, their faces filled with anger and concern. Some promised to post the videos online, to make sure the world saw what had happened. Emily closed her eyes, her body weak but her mind racing. Little did she know, this horrifying moment would not only change her life forever but also ignite a wave of outrage that would sweep across the nation, uniting people in the fight for justice. Ethan Carter was finishing his shift at a shipping plant when his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw the name of a close friend flash on the screen. Normally, Ethan might have let the call go to voicemail, but something told him this wasn't a routine conversation. When he answered, his friend's voice was frantic. "Ethan, it's Emily. She's in the hospital." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with worry. "She was attacked," the friend said. "A police officer, he kicked her in the stomach." "Ethan, you need to get to the hospital. Now." The words barely registered. Ethan's mind raced as he grabbed his keys and bolted for his car. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, speeding through the streets of Dallas as adrenaline coursed through him. His wife, his strong, resilient Emily, was in the hospital, and their unborn child was at risk. The thought of losing either of them was unbearable. When Ethan arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the hum of machines greeted him. He rushed to the front desk, his voice cracking as he asked for Emily. The nurse directed him to the emergency room, where he found her lying on a hospital bed. The sight of her nearly brought him to his knees. Emily looked pale, her face etched with pain. Wires and tubes surrounded her, monitoring her heart rate and oxygen levels. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, as if shielding their baby from further harm. Ethan knelt by her side, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here." Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Ethan," she said weakly, he kicked me." "The baby?" "Sure," he said, squeezing her hand tightly. "You're going to be okay. Both of you. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." But even as he spoke the words, a storm of anger and helplessness raged within him. How could someone entrusted with protecting the public inflict such cruelty on a pregnant woman? How could anyone stand by and let this happen? The weight of those questions pressed down on him, threatening to crush his composure. The doctor arrived shortly after, his expression serious but calm. "Mr. Carter," he began, "your wife and baby are stable for now. But it was a close call. The stress and trauma could have caused premature labor, and we'll need to monitor her closely over the next few days." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by a burning need for justice. He knew that what had happened to Emily couldn't be ignored. Her pain, Her fear, it demanded accountability. As Emily drifted into an uneasy sleep, Ethan stayed by her side, gripping her hand as if his strength alone could shield her from further harm. His mind turned to his military training, the discipline and determination that had carried him through countless battles. This time, his mission wasn't on a battlefield overseas, it was here, in his own community, fighting for the two people who meant everything to him. He vowed silently, "This isn't over. I'll make him pay for what he's done." The next morning, Ethan Carter woke with a heaviness in his chest. He had spent the night by Emily's bedside, his mind spinning with plans and questions. The faint rhythm of the hospital monitors provided a small comfort, but it did little to quell the storm brewing inside him. Emily's pale face and the stillness of the room served as stark reminders of the fragility of their situation. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, Ethan slipped out to make a call. His military instincts kicked in, and he knew this fight would require more than anger. He needed allies, evidence, and a strategy. Dialing a number he hadn't used in years, he reached out to an old friend from his time in the Marines, a journalist now working for a major publication. "Tom, it's Ethan," he said, his voice steady but cold. "I need your help." Within hours, Tom and his team were combing through social media, collecting videos of the incident. What they found was damning. Multiple witnesses had captured Officer Brian Collins kicking Emily, his face twisted in anger, as she crumpled to the ground. The footage was raw and gut-wrenching, showing the shocked crowd as they shouted for him to stop. Ethan watched the clips in silence, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "This is going public," Tom said firmly. "People need to see what happened." Ethan nodded. "Do it. I won't let him get away with this." As the videos began circulating online, the response was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForEmily and #EndPoliceViolence started trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the calls for accountability. Protests began forming across Dallas, with people of all ages and backgrounds coming together to demand justice for Emily and their unborn child. Back at the hospital, Emily watched the news from her bed. Tears welled in her eyes as she saw the growing support from strangers who were moved by her story. Ethan sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "They're fighting for you," he said softly. Emily turned to him, her voice trembling. "It's not just for me, Ethan. This is for every person who's been hurt and silenced. I want to be part of this." Ethan hesitated. "You need to rest. Your health and the baby come first." "I know," she said, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "But this can't be just about us. If we can stop this from happening to someone else, we have to try." Ethan saw the fire in her eyes, the same strength that had drawn him to her years ago. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. Together, they would face this battle. Meanwhile, Officer Collins sat in his precinct, watching the news coverage with growing unease. His usual arrogance faltered as he realized the scale of the backlash. For years, he had operated with impunity, shielded by the system that enabled his behavior. But now, for the first time, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. "This will blow over," he muttered to a colleague, though his voice lacked conviction. But deep down, he knew this time was different. Ethan Carter wasn't just any angry husband. He was a man on a mission. And Collins was about to face a reckoning unlike any he had ever imagined. The days that followed were a whirlwind of action for Ethan Carter. He moved with precision and focus, leveraging his military training to organize a full-scale campaign for justice. His first priority was gathering evidence enough to dismantle Officer Brian Collins and the corrupt system that had protected him for so long. Ethan reached out to witnesses who had been present during the attack. Many were hesitant at first, fearful of retaliation, but Ethan's calm demeanor and clear sense of purpose reassured them. "This isn't just about Emily," he told them. It's about making sure no one else has to suffer like this. One by one, they shared their stories. A young mother who had been grocery shopping described the horror she felt watching Emily collapse to the ground. An elderly man recounted how Collins had glared at the crowd, daring anyone to intervene. Several of them handed over their video recordings, adding to the mounting evidence against the officer. Ethan didn't stop there. He began combing through public records, looking for complaints against Collins. What he found was staggering: a history of excessive force complaints, all quietly dismissed by the Dallas Police Department. The patterns were clear: Collins wasn't a rogue officer, he was a symptom of a deeply flawed system. Each file fueled Ethan's resolve, solidifying his mission. Meanwhile, the public outcry continued to grow. Protests spread across Dallas, with crowds gathering outside the police precinct where Collins worked. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Emily" and "Stop Police Violence" filled the air as people chanted in unison. Community leaders, activists, and even local politicians began to speak out, condemning the attack and calling for reform. Back at the hospital, Emily found herself at the center of the movement. Though she was still recovering, her determination never wavered. She spent her days writing statements and giving interviews from her hospital bed, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not just a victim," she told a reporter during a video call. "I'm a mother fighting for my child's future and for a world where no one has to face what I went through." Ethan marveled at her strength. Watching her speak with such clarity and conviction reminded him why he had fallen in love with her. Emily wasn't just his partner, she was his anchor. The reason he believed in fighting for a better world. As the momentum of the movement grew, an unexpected ally came forward: Officer Jacob Harris. A young, idealistic cop with less than 3 years on the force. Harris had long been disillusioned by the corruption he had witnessed. After seeing the attack on Emily, he decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. Harris reached out to Ethan through a mutual contact, agreeing to meet in secret. When they sat down in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, Harris was visibly nervous. But his resolve was clear. "I've seen what Collins has done," he said. "And I've seen how the department protects him. I want to help." Harris provided Ethan with crucial evidence: internal documents that detailed how complaints against Collins were buried and reports were altered to shield him from accountability. The information was a game changer, offering an inside look at the corruption within the department. Ethan thanked Harris, understanding the risk the young officer was taking. "You're doing the right thing," he said, gripping his hand firmly. "Together, we'll make sure they can't hide anymore." With this new evidence, Ethan's fight entered a new phase. The movement was no longer just about Emily, it was about exposing an entire system. As he left the diner that evening, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, he believed real change was within reach. Part 5. Ethan Carter knew the battle wasn't over yet. With Officer Jacob Harris's evidence in hand, he and his team began piecing together the larger picture of corruption within the Dallas Police Department. The files painted a damning portrait of a department plagued by systemic issues, officers covering for one another, reports falsified, and abuses of power swept under the rug. It was clear that Officer Brian Collins was just one part of a much larger machine. Ethan sat at his kitchen table late into the night, surrounded by stacks of documents and his laptop. He had transformed his home into a makeshift war room, where every detail of the case was meticulously analyzed. Despite the exhaustion evident in his face, he remained focused, driven by the thought of Emily and their unborn child. This fight wasn't just about them anymore, it was about dismantling a system that had allowed injustice to thrive. As the days passed, the movement continued to grow. The protests, which had started in Dallas, began to spread to other cities. Social media was ablaze with posts, hashtags, and videos calling for justice. People who had never met Emily felt a personal connection to her story, and it became a rallying cry for change. In the midst of this chaos, Ethan received a chilling phone call late one evening. The voice on the other end was cold and deliberate. "Back off. Carter," the caller warned. "This is bigger than you. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Ethan felt his grip tighten around the phone. But he refused to be intimidated. "You've already made the biggest mistake of your life," he replied. His voice steady. "You came after my family. Now I'm coming for you." He hung up. His jaw clenched. The threat only fueled his resolve. If they thought intimidation would stop him, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Ethan's military training had taught him to prepare for every possibility. He doubled down on security for Emily, hiring a private guard to watch over her at the hospital. He also began keeping a close eye on his surroundings, noting suspicious cars parked near his home and strangers lingering near the hospital. The stakes were higher than ever. But Ethan was undeterred. Meanwhile, Officer Collins was feeling the walls close in. The media coverage, the protests, and the mounting evidence against him were more than he had anticipated. His usual smug confidence was replaced by unease, though he tried to maintain a facade of control. "This will blow over," he told a colleague in the precinct. Though even he didn't believe it anymore. What Collins didn't know was that Ethan had no intention of letting this blow over. With the support of his legal team, civil rights activists, and the public, Ethan was preparing to take the fight directly to the police department. He knew the only way to achieve lasting change was to hold not just Collins but the entire system accountable. The next step in Ethan's plan was bold: a public confrontation with the department's leadership. He wanted them to see the evidence, to face the truth they had tried so hard to bury. It wasn't just about Brian Collins anymore, it was about every victim who had been silenced, every family torn apart by injustice. Ethan was determined to make sure no one would ever forget Emily's name. The morning of the confrontation arrived, and Ethan Carter stood outside the Dallas Police Department, the thick folder of evidence in his hands. His heart pounded. But not from fear, he was fueled by determination. Beside him stood a group of civil rights lawyers, human rights activists, and even Jacob Harris, the whistleblower officer whose testimony had been pivotal in exposing the department's corruption. A crowd of protesters had gathered outside the station, their signs raised high. Slogans like "Justice for Emily" and "Hold them accountable" filled the air as chants of solidarity echoed down the street. News cameras captured every moment, ensuring that the world was watching. Ethan stepped through the station's doors with his allies, his resolve unwavering. Inside, the tension was palpable. Officers glanced at him as he passed, some with thinly veiled disdain, others with quiet resignation. He knew the department had been bracing for this moment, but they had underestimated his resolve. Officer Brian Collins sat in his office, staring at the surveillance monitor that showed Ethan approaching. His once confident smirk was replaced by a scowl of frustration. For years, he had operated with impunity, shielded by his connections and the department's unspoken code of silence. But now, the walls were closing in. He muttered to himself, "They think they can take me down? Let them try." Ethan and his team entered the station's main conference room, where senior officers had been summoned. The room was cold and clinical, with a long table and harsh fluorescent lighting. The department's leadership sat stiffly, their expressions a mix of defiance and unease. Ethan placed the folder on the table, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to present evidence of Officer Brian Collins's misconduct and the systemic corruption that has enabled him." One of the lawyers opened the folder, revealing a collection of documents, video evidence, and witness statements. As the pages were passed around, the weight of the evidence became undeniable. It wasn't just about Emily anymore, this was about years of abuse, cover-ups, and a culture of impunity. Jacob Harris stood up to speak, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I joined this department to protect and serve, not to stand by while my colleagues abuse their power." What happened to Emily Carter isn't an isolated incident, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. And today, it ends. The room fell silent. The gravity of his words sinking in. Officer Collins, who had been sitting at the back of the room, finally exploded in anger. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "These are lies, fabricated evidence." Ethan turned to him, his gaze cold and unyielding. "The only lie here is the one you've been living. Collins, your time is up." Just then, representatives from Internal Affairs entered the room, their presence signaling the department's unwillingness to continue shielding Collins. One of them stepped forward, reading aloud a suspension and arrest order. As the cuffs were placed on Collins's wrists, he thrashed and shouted, "You'll regret this. This isn't over." Ethan watched as Collins was led out of the room, his expression stoic. The crowd outside erupted into cheers as they saw the officer in handcuffs. Signs were raised higher, and chants of justice for Emily grew louder. But Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Collins's arrest was a victory, but the system that had protected him was still standing. As he stepped outside to address the crowd, he raised his voice to ensure everyone could hear him. "This fight isn't just about my wife, it's about all of us. It's about every person who has been silenced, every family that has suffered. And we won't stop until the system that allowed this injustice is dismantled." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy electric. For the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope that real change was possible. Brian Collins sat in a cold, grey holding cell, the sounds of the police station echoing faintly through the walls. His hands, now free of cuffs, rested heavily on his lap, but his shoulders remained tense. The arrogance he had worn like armor for years was stripped away, replaced by something unfamiliar, doubt. For the first time, he realized that the system he had relied on to shield him was starting to crumble. As the news of his arrest spread, the department faced mounting scrutiny. Public outrage continued to grow, with activists and citizens alike demanding broader accountability. The protests outside the station intensified, drawing not just locals but people from neighboring cities who had been inspired by Emily's story. Inside the Carter household, Ethan was also grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. Collins's arrest was a significant victory, but he knew it was only the tip of the iceberg. Sitting at the kitchen table late that night, he sifted through the evidence Jacob Harris had provided, his eyes scanning the documents with laser focus. Each page revealed more about the deep-rooted corruption within the department, bribes, falsified reports, and patterns of covering up abuse. It wasn't just about Collins anymore, it was about an entire network of complicity. Emily, still recovering in the hospital, called him as he worked. Her voice was soft but filled with resolve. "Ethan, I saw the news. You did it." He smiled faintly, his fingers tightening around the phone. "We did it, Emily. But it's not over yet. There's so much more to uncover." There was a pause on the other end before she replied. "I know you won't stop. But don't forget what matters most, our family. Promise me you'll take care of yourself, too." "I promise," Ethan said, though he knew the fight ahead would demand everything he had. The next morning, Ethan received a call from federal prosecutor Daniel Armstrong, a man renowned for taking down corrupt institutions. Armstrong had been following the case closely and was intrigued by the evidence Ethan and his team had collected. "Mr. Carter," Armstrong began, his voice firm and authoritative, "I believe we have the foundation for something much bigger here. This isn't just about one officer, it's about an entire culture of corruption. If you're willing, I'd like to take this fight to the federal level." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes. Let's make it happen." Armstrong's involvement brought new momentum to the case. A formal federal investigation was launched into the Dallas Police Department, and the media frenzy surrounding the story reached new heights. For the first time, High-ranking officers who had previously remained untouchable found themselves under scrutiny. Some cooperated, eager to save themselves, while others resisted, their silence speaking volumes. Emily watched these developments unfold from her hospital bed, feeling a mix of hope and determination. "This is what we've been fighting for," she told Ethan during one of his visits. "It's bigger than us now." Ethan nodded, his hand resting on hers. "And we're not stopping until it's finished." As the federal investigation gained traction, the Carter family became symbols of resilience and justice. Their story inspired others to come forward with their own experiences of police violence and corruption. The movement was no longer just about Emily, it had become a beacon of hope for a community that had endured too much for too long. Ethan knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With the support of his wife, his allies, and the growing movement, he felt more determined than ever to dismantle the system that had caused so much pain. The federal investigation into the Dallas Police Department began to uncover layers of corruption deeper than anyone had anticipated. Prosecutor Daniel Armstrong worked tirelessly, supported by the evidence Ethan Carter and Officer Jacob Harris had provided. Every new revelation sent shockwaves through the community, exposing a culture of impunity that had allowed officers like Brian Collins to operate unchecked for years. As the investigation gained momentum, Ethan found himself in a delicate balancing act. His days were consumed by meetings with Armstrong, journalists, and lawyers, while his evenings were spent at the hospital, where Emily's condition was steadily improving. Each visit reminded him of why he was fighting so hard. Her resilience was his anchor, and every smile she gave him strengthened his resolve. One evening, as Ethan sat by Emily's bedside, she took his hand. "Ethan, you've done so much already," she said softly, "but don't lose sight of what matters most. Our family needs you as much as this fight does." Her words struck a chord. Ethan had been so consumed by the mission that he realized he hadn't taken a moment to breathe. "I won't," he promised. "I'm doing this for us, for you, for the baby, and for every family that's been through what we have. But I'll make sure I don't lose myself in it." Meanwhile, the investigation revealed a network of senior officers who had protected Collins and others like him. These officers had suppressed complaints, altered reports, and even intimidated victims into silence. The evidence painted a damning picture of systemic rot. And as the federal team dug deeper, it became clear that reform would require dismantling long-standing power structures. As public pressure mounted, the protests outside the police station grew larger. The movement had transcended Emily's case, becoming a symbol of resistance against injustice. People from all walks of life came together, their voices echoing through the streets. Chants of justice for Emily and reform the system filled the air, a unified cry for change. Officer Jacob Harris became a key figure in the investigation, his courage inspiring other whistleblowers to come forward. At a press conference organized by the federal team, Harris stood beside Ethan and Prosecutor Armstrong. His voice was steady as he addressed the crowd. "I joined this department to serve my community, but I quickly realized that the system was broken. Today, I'm standing here to say enough is enough. We can't change the past, but we can fight for a better future." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the growing momentum of the movement. Inside the station, Brian Collins sat alone in a holding cell. The walls, once a symbol of his authority, now felt like a cage. He watched the news coverage on a small television, his face devoid of its usual smugness. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. For years, he had believed he was untouchable. Now, he was the face of everything wrong with the system. As the investigation continued, Ethan realized the importance of not just dismantling corruption but building something better in its place. He began working with local activists to propose reforms, better oversight, community policing initiatives, and increased accountability. The fight wasn't just about tearing down the old, It was about creating a system that truly served the people. Ethan and Emily's journey had become a beacon of hope. But it was also a reminder of the cost of change. As they prepared for the next phase of their fight, they knew the road ahead would be long. But they were ready. Together, they had already accomplished what once seemed impossible, and they were just getting started.